Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me this morning. So I would like to invite Raees Calafato, who is preparing his presentation. The presentation is in English. As you know, he's from the University of Bergen again, and his focus is on foreign language didactics. So good morning from Florida, and hello to everybody.
Hi, everybody. I hope that you can hear me well. So yeah, I'm from the University of Bergen, and I'm focusing on multilingualism and how teachers and learners can benefit from their knowledge of other languages when they learn a new language. And so let me go over here. Yeah, so this project, so I'll be discussing the second phase of this project. The first phase of this project has already been sort of done in Norway and Russia, and it was based on 517 language teachers of different languages. So you had English, French, German, Spanish, Chinese, and Italian. And this is basically the second part. It's like an outgrowth where I'm exploring certain things further. So before I start, like what exactly is the project and why am I doing it? So I'm doing it because there's a need to. I'll get back. I'll come to that a bit later. I first want to say that why is it? Yeah. So basically, the project, it investigates language teachers in Norway and Russia. It investigates their multilingualism, which is their knowledge of other languages, and how they kind of use that knowledge during lessons. I've chosen Norway and Russia, well, not only because it's convenient, I'm based in Norway, but also because there hasn't been much research on multilingualism in Norway and Russia. When you think about acquired multilingualism, there's been a lot of research on immigrants coming to Norway, for example, and that kind of biographic multilingualism, but hasn't been much of a focus on how do you become multilingual and how can teachers help you to become that? How can teachers help you to acquire new languages more effectively, more quickly. And so Norway and Russia allow me to have this sort of cross-cultural approach where I can compare the two. You know, Norway is more like the European experience in terms of language education, and Russia is on sort of there. It's on the borders, kind of. It's on the periphery of Europe. You know, it's like it's European, but also not European. It has different approaches. It has had different historical approaches to language education. It's been much more isolated in the past. So it provides a good sort of contrast to Norway. And it also allows me to sort of investigate whether context, whether being in Norway or being in Russia actually influenced the way teachers approach multilingualism, like their students' multilingualism, their own multilingualism, and the kind of practices they use. Again, multilingualism here is defined as the use of more than one language, so it includes bilingualism. It's the use of more than one language by individuals. I'm not focusing on societal multilingualism because people can be monolingual in a multilingual society. For example, in Belgium or other places, somebody speaks French, somebody speaks German, Flemish, etc. But it doesn't mean that everybody's multilingual. So my focus is on individual multilingualism and how to sort of, use that as a resource when learning additional languages. And basically, this part of the project focuses on teachers' multilingual practices, and that's because I wanted to explore this a bit further. Because during the first phase, I found that, which is where I sort of investigated their beliefs and their teaching practices a little bit. I found that it didn't really matter how positive they were about multilingualism. You have a lot of studies that have focused on what teachers think about the fact that they have multicultural, multilingual classrooms, and you generally have very positive attitudes that teachers sort of evince. For example, they'll be like, "Yeah, it's great that all my students speak all these different languages, and it's a really big asset, and it's a really good resource, and everybody should try to be multilingual." But then when people actually kind of see their practices and how they try to help their students benefit from this multilingualism, they see that their beliefs really don't correlate. There's no real connection. It's a really weak connection, if anything. And so they might have positive beliefs, but they teach quite monolingually. So I wanted to explore further is like, what exactly, if it's not beliefs, if it's not their positive attitudes, what exactly influences their, their practices in the classroom. I took a look at language policy, the curriculum. I took a look at other things to make sure is like, what exactly encourages them, or what exactly influences them, convinces them to use, practices like that draw on their students' multilingualism and their own. The reason that I'm doing this is, cities are becoming more culturally and linguistically diverse. It's not only in Europe, where you already had some linguistic diversity, but it's like places like China, the Gulf states have been very super diverse. You've got like hundreds of nationalities over there. Even places like Russia are becoming more and more multilingual. You've got not only expats, but the people, the local population is also becoming quite multilingual. 2-3 languages now is not such a, it's not like a big unique thing anymore. Before, everybody just spoke Russian, maybe a few spoke English or German, but now it's like you have several multilingual, citizens, especially in Moscow. So things are changing. And you're finding that even classrooms are changing. So now it's also like in Norway and other things, teachers are finding that students are coming from very different language backgrounds, Arabic and Urdu and Turkish and a bunch of other stuff. And so it's like, how do you teach your students in the same way as you did like 30, 40 years ago, where it was homogenous and everybody spoke only Norwegian, for example, right? The traditional approach has always been quite monolingual. What I mean by that is that you teach language as if you were a native speaker. So even if you're like a non-native speaker of English, you pretend to be a native speaker. You only speak English in the classroom. You discourage your students from using other languages. It's like a rather an artificial kind of a thing that you create for them, this experience. And it's quite popular even now. So you have this, especially for like a lot of schools and language institutes, they will tell their teachers, just use the target language, just speak in that. So that, pretend to be a native speaker, even if you're not. And that hasn't really worked out well. So personal experience, and also what I see, like, having lived and worked in other countries, is that it doesn't really work. You've got students learning languages for 5, 8, 9 years, and they're not progressing. There's no progress. And so what you have is like there's an awareness of this in countries. So like you've got Russia and Norway. They've kind of realized that there needs to be a change in the way languages are taught, because the traditional approach isn't really working as much. And so they've started to implement initiatives that not only encourage students to learn more languages, but they encourage these students, or encourage teachers to kind of use this multilingualism, sort of not teach monolingually, but to teach it in a way that better reflects the fact that their students and they themselves speak multiple languages. They know multiple languages, right? So there's like a move away from this native speaker ideal. And of course, there's obviously a need to have multilingual citizens. I mean, the world is changing. It's no longer enough to speak English. There's a realization, especially among younger generations and even parents, that they need to need to have their kids learn a couple of languages, just in terms of career mobility and other things. It's important. And so my thing was to look at, you have these initiatives in Russia and Norway and other countries in Europe, and there's a move towards kind of this more multilingual teaching in the classroom, which has not been the case. So like traditionally, even teacher education programs have not had any focus on multilingualism. You just teach the language that you are supposed to teach, and you're not supposed to really think about all the other languages or all the other languages your students know. But that's changing now. So in terms of theory, why is the monolingual approach not a good idea? It's not a good idea because let's say that we all start out as monolinguals. We only speak one language, our first language. Yeah, but sometimes that's not even the case if you have like mixed families. But as soon as you start learning another language, something happens to your mind, to your like cognition and stuff, and you're no longer monolingual. And so it doesn't make sense to teach you monolingually anymore, because that's not who you are anymore. So it's you can use the dynamic systems approach to multilingualism as a way to conceptualize this thing, is that once you start learning another language, basically it affects your abilities and cognitions in a way that it expands your resources. It just makes you a whole different person, right? And so when you're taught languages, teachers need to take this into account. What I mean by multilingualism here is not so much knowledge of different dialects. So it's not like you know British English, American English, and Jamaican English, and that's your multilingual. What I'm trying to focus more is on distinct language systems. And I mean that when you learn a distinct, like another language system, this kind of makes you a very different person. And so you need a different approach to learning languages. And so, what do I mean by specifically teaching multilingually? Well, on a basic level, that includes translanguaging, using multiple languages consciously and with a specific purpose. So it's to create meaning, to point out differences. You can do code switching as well. You can do cross-linguistic comparisons. You've got intercomprehension for the Romance languages, but then you also can do a lot of things. For example, if you come from a Romance background and you're learning Chinese or Japanese, like there are still certain strategies and other things that you can do to learn and get a much more deeper understanding of the language that you're learning in a way that also reinforces the languages that you already know. And so then you have a couple of different, I don't have enough time to go into all of this stuff, but there are a number of different multilingual teaching practices that you can use that differ significantly from the monolingual approach where only the target language is used. And so you have a couple of countries that are now stressing and focusing on this a little bit more. And that's why I decided to sort of research this. So as I said, I've already done, like, with 517 teachers, I found out that they're very positive about multilingualism, but it doesn't really correlate with their beliefs. It doesn't really influence how they teach in the classrooms. And so I wanted to find out, well, what does influence their adoption of a multilingual pedagogy, which is these practices. It could be translanguaging, use of cognates, cross-linguistic comparison, etc. Like how do they actually draw on do they draw on these other languages, and what it influences them to do so? It's important because there is a move away. There's a realization that you cannot teach multilinguals monolingually, and I wanted to see how much of that has trickled down to the teachers. And I also wanted, and so another thing that's maybe a little bit unique about this project is that a lot of language teachers in Europe and elsewhere, they're not just teaching one language; they're teaching like more than one. So there are teachers who are teaching 2 languages. There are also some who are teaching 3 languages. So I actually was fortunate enough to have a lot of participants from the phase 1 part who were teaching more than one foreign language at the same time. So they were teaching 2 languages, and I wanted to see their cognition, like the process, the things going around in their heads, and how they approached, like, was there, how did they approach each of the languages that they taught, and was there a difference, based on language or something else? And I also wanted to see if there were differences in how they were teaching in Norway and Russia, like, for example, like cultural or society or education, for example, what kind of an effect that had on them. And so what kind of methods did I use? So the first phase was a questionnaire with 517. This one was more specific, and it was 21 participants in total. So there was 10 from Norway and 11 from Russia. I actually received positive responses from 74 teachers at the beginning, but then COVID happened, and a lot of them, it went, let's say, dark. My 21 ultimately participated. I was completely random at the same time. I mean, I did not select them based on any criterion other than they should be language teachers and they should be teaching at upper secondary schools in Norway or Russia. And the reason that I chose upper secondary is because in Norway and Russia, you learn a second foreign language. The first foreign language is English almost all the time. The second one you start learning around in secondary school. So I wanted to, in order to get enough participants who were teaching, let's say, more than one language, and to make sure that there was, like, that they were in fact teaching other foreign languages other than English, I had to sort of choose secondary schools. Out of the 21 participants, 10 only taught one foreign language, while 11 taught 2 foreign languages. So it's like almost 50-50. Allows me to compare their practices and their cognition based on whether they're teaching one, their level of multilingualism as far as their teaching is concerned. The interviews were open format. I didn't there were no leading questions. I did not use multilingualism. I did not push them. The focus was more on to let them speak and to speak about their teaching and to gain insights through that without having to, forcibly guide them through stuff. I also didn't want to use multilingualism explicitly with them because a lot of teachers associate, or teachers can associate, multilingualism with biographic multilingualism. A lot of teachers think, especially for example in Norway and stuff, when you use, like you say, multilingual in Norwegian, one might think about immigrants and not people learning multiple languages. So there's a bit of a some people might think about multilingualism as purely biographic, and so I focused more on using words like learning multiple languages, knowing sort of becoming proficient in multiple languages, and not specifically multilingualism. And when I focused on the analysis, I looked at the teachers as their reflexivity, their use of their how they drew on their multilingualism, what factors influenced that, and also my findings from the first phase in terms of their beliefs and practices. So what did I find? As in the phase one, as during phase one, they were all pretty positive about multilingualism. They thought it was a good thing. They thought learning multiple languages is good. It's good for your career. It's good for travel. It's good for the future. It's good for intercultural increasing that competence of yours, being able to communicate with other people from other countries, understanding their increasing empathy, etc. And that was fine. What I also found was that although, like in Norway and Russia, you have now this increased focus on learning multiple languages in the curriculum, like the Ministry of Education and in both countries kind of stress learning multiple languages and using these languages across subjects in the Russian case, that the teachers really did not really care about the curriculum so much. It did not seem to influence them whatsoever in terms of their practices. Some of them did not really even read it up so deeply. So I basically found that they did not really care too much about the curriculum. Some of them had read it, but they sort of used it loosely and it didn't have any influence on them, which is something that I guess the ministries in some countries need to take a look at. Is like, to what extent does the curriculum actually influence concrete activity practices, teacher practices in the classroom? How much of that actually translates into actual action? So while the curricula did not really influence them, what did influence them really very, very strongly were these three things and it was across all of these 21 participants, regardless of whether they were teaching one or two languages or whether they were from Norway and Russia, and that was proficiency, positioning, and support. That's what I've called them. And what I mean by proficiency is that how confident they were in their language knowledge. Almost all the participants were unbalanced multilinguals, especially the ones teaching two languages. So for example, let's say you had a teacher who was teaching French and German or English and Chinese. It often happened that they felt that they were better in one language and not as good in the other. And that kind of affected the extent to which they used multilingual practices. So if they were more confident in one language, like knowing in their ability, they would engage more often in these multilingual practices. And if you, for example, had the rare teacher who was confident in both languages, then you had sort of a situation where they would draw from both these languages. So let's say if they had students in English and the same students in Chinese, they would actually kind of fuse and sort of reinforce their students' knowledge of language, from in both classes. So the higher their proficiency was, and this is as in terms of their knowledge of the language, the much stronger was their use of translanguaging, because I guess they felt like they were much more confident switching between languages and knowing when to switch and not being afraid of experimenting because they felt like they had a better grasp of the language. There was also an issue with the nature of their multilingualism, and that was were they able to verbalize? So, if, for example, you had an English teacher who had learned English naturally, implicitly, they were unable to really engage in they couldn't use English in translanguaging because they didn't have that knowledge of, let's say, English grammar and structure in the way that they could verbalize it, and so that affected their ability to engage in practices. That's another thing, is that what kind of knowledge do teachers possess? They might be proficient in English, but what is that? That doesn't say anything about whether they have the meta-linguistic awareness to actually engage in stuff like translanguaging, etc., which requires a certain amount of meta-linguistic awareness. Positioning. was is how they perceive themselves as language users. So those teachers who most often engaged in multilingual teaching practices were ones that were continuously improving their language. So if you had like, for example, a Chinese teacher or a German teacher, they were constantly attending German workshops as learners. They were constantly building. So a lot of these were also like non-native. They were almost all non-native speaker teachers. And so they were constantly improving their language. So they were not only language teachers, but they were also language learners of the languages they were teaching continuously. So tests and workshops and and so that was one part of their positioning. The other part was that a lot of them were also learning another language. So they were constantly, they were in their heads, they were also like language learners, like constantly, whether of the languages they taught or of newer languages. And they were also kind of studying and analyzing the language of their students. So they had Arabic students, they would develop an interest in Arabic, start learning Arabic, and then use that in the lesson. So they had this kind of desire to learn languages and improve their language ability. And for those who didn't do this, I found across the board that they didn't really engage in these practices that often. And finally, there was support, which basically came in two forms. It was either colleagues, it could be like a senior teacher. It was almost never the administration. It was almost always a teacher, another teacher who was, more senior, more kind of experienced with these kind of practices, and so they drew inspiration from them, or they less often accessed research. So if they were fortunate enough to, for example, attend a workshop somewhere where multilingualism was being discussed, they would access research and they would draw inspiration and kind of activities from the research they read through that way. But it was not something that was done quite often. So research was actually not accessed by a lot of teachers. And so based on the study, what I found was that you have a lot of multilingual initiatives out there right now, where it's like multilingualism is a good thing. It's an important resource, and it's we should use it, etc. But I feel that based on this study, it's likely to fail if all these initiatives do is they focus on sort of improving your beliefs about it. If all they focus on is like the students, just purely on the students, or kind of trying to convince teachers that multilingual is a good thing, it's going to fail, because their beliefs don't really correspond to their practices. If you want to improve, if you want to really help these teachers teach multilingually and draw on their students' knowledge of other languages than their own, you're gonna. I think it's much more important to focus on their proficiency. So it's important to reconceptualize teachers not only as like teachers, but also as advanced language learners, I guess. Which means that if you're talking about teacher education programs, it shouldn't just be a focus on didactics, that you need to also actually focus on developing their language ability further. So it's like continuous learning as a language learner. This could be encouraging them to learn a new language as well, but also making sure that they feel confident in their, with respect to the language that they already teach. I don't think a lot of research actually looks at that. Most research looks at teachers like this, like the apex. Like it's assumed that they are, perfect users, or they have enough knowledge of the languages they teach. But as far as this study has shown, that's not always the case. Like they can just be advanced language users. They're not necessarily as confident in their abilities, and that affects. That's also why a lot of them might stick to just textbooks, because they find it safe. They don't want to venture outside because they don't have that kind of knowledge. Another thing that can be implemented based on the study is peer support groups, or this thing where tandem, where they are paired together with another teacher more senior, and has done all these things, like in terms of multilingual teaching practices, and that's something that somebody that they can draw inspiration from, and somebody that can help them, which is also something that I think teacher education programs should try more often. And also greater engagement with the research community. There's always this thing that teachers don't read research. That might be true, but researchers should engage more with them more actively, and help them access what's out there, because again, teachers might be busy. They might not know about all the the data, like that's out there. So I think researchers should be more proactive in getting the word out to the teachers. Another thing, and finally, it's about, I think, meta-linguistic knowledge. So that had a huge influence. It was not just proficiency, but also the type of proficiency that you had. If you're going to be more like sort of a natural, learner, or like a natural knowledge of the language, chances are that you will not be able to really use these practices. And that's also in a way bad for the students, because they will not be given the tools to learn additional language later on. So meta-linguistic awareness is always good, especially if they want to go on and learn languages after they've learned the one that you're teaching. And teaching them naturally does not help with that. So it's important to also focus on, try to do away with this monolingual approach where it's just it's like the native speaker kind of thing, because that might not be actually quite helpful for students or teachers. And I believe that's it. That's the end of my presentation. So yeah. So I have one question over here. Is Norway was subordinate to neighbors for decades, while various Russia states imposed this language on other groups. Do these different histories influence modern attitudes? No, not at all. So it doesn't. I thought that the Norwegian participants would be more open, and they would actually be using multilingual teaching practices more frequently than the Russian participants. And I found that no, that was not the case whatsoever. That context, it doesn't really matter what's there in official documents so much. It didn't really have so much of an influence on them. And that was the same thing that I found during the phase 1 thing as well, is that their attitudes, it was Russian or Norway, there wasn't that big a difference. There were some differences, but I wouldn't call them like huge or always very statistically significant. So no, I think it doesn't really influence teachers to such an extent. What I found was it's basically their like I said, like their confidence in their ability, which is not often very high, and especially if you're teaching more than one language, it's quite unstable, and so that certainly needs to be looked at more closely, as well as their positioning, which is, how do they actually approach the languages that they teach? Is it just something that they go to school or university, they teach, and then they forget about until the next lesson starts, or are they actively developing their knowledge of this language? Are they learning another language? Because I think that has a big influence on their ability to teach multilingually. And finally, it's the support thing, is like access to research and support from peers. So that's it then. I'm done. Thanks for listening.